Hello and welcome to Breaking Bread with Rivaaj Maharaj, where nothing is off the table. For today's episode, I want to talk about Britain and the UK now saying that it is ready to seize Russian shadow fleet ships. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now, a few days ago, there was an article that came out in the BBC News titled, "The UK now ready to seize Russian shadow fleet ships," Healy says. And the article basically, British forces are now ready to act to board and detain ships in Russia's so-called shadow fleet in UK waters, the Defense Secretary has said. Russia has been accused of operating ships without a valid national flag to avoid sanctions on oil and help fund its war in Ukraine. Ministers identified a legal basis in January that would allow forces to board sanctioned vessels, but approval for the military measure was not given by the Prime Minister until Thursday. Question on that decision had not come sooner. John Healy told BBC Radio 4's Today programme, "What operations like this require is training, preparation, understanding, discussion with allies and a clear legal basis." Healy said these points are now lined up and ready, and the decision represented a signal that we will take action when we see illegal and sanctioned shadow ships. This is a signal to Putin that he may want us to be distracted by the Middle East, but we are ready to act, he added. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the UK's decision to seize Russian-sanctioned vehicles was a timely move, particularly now when global pressure on Russia is quietly loosening. It's hardly a secret that Russia funnels illegal oil revenues directly into its war machine, he said in a post on X. Anything that cuts off that flow brings peace closer and makes Europe safer. Sanctioned tankers must be stopped, their oil seized. Now, you know this comment by Zelensky on X, anything that cuts off the flow brings peace closer and makes Europe safer. I'll tell you now that is a load of hogwash. This oil has been sanctioned by not only the Europeans but the Americans since the war began. And we're now 5 years into that war, and it hasn't brought us closer to peace. What has brought us closer to peace was the United States having a change of administration where Donald Trump is unwilling to forego any more input by the US into this war unless it is paid for by NATO. That has brought us closer to peace, and the Russian onslaught on Ukraine. If sanctions, as he says, Zelensky says in this post, brings us closer to peace, he's talking nonsense, because then this war would not have carried on for 4 years. If anything, the sanctions had emboldened the Russian economy when the war started. And this war in Iran is helping fill Putin's coffers because the price of oil has skyrocketed. Now, what I would like you to understand is that there are two distinct wars being fought at the moment. The Ukraine war is one, and the Iran war is the second. And they're both proxy wars. The Ukraine war is a proxy war between NATO, primarily Britain, because the warmonger in this instance is Britain together with the EU. And under a Biden administration, they were supported 100% by the Americans. Trump has come in and turned the script. He wants to now do business with the Russians, and he wants this war over and done with. He does not want to be seen to be involved in this war, and he's made this clear from day one. What you see happening in Iran by way of the British flip-flopping, the EU flip-flopping, Kaja Kallas coming out and saying that there's no appetite within Europe to want to send vessels to the Straits of Hormuz. That is not that Europe has suddenly grown a conscience and does not want to be involved in a war, or Britain has grown a conscience. Far from it. While they use the Iraq war as precedent, that they do not want to go into an illegal war, WMDs, fake WMD stories and that, and while all that may be true, they're using it as a precedent to justify what they are doing now. What they're not telling you is that the reason they're not actively involved there is because there is a split between NATO in terms of the United States and the rest of Europe. There is a split. The United States no longer sees Europe as an ally. The United States treats everybody as a foe, but there are varying degrees of foe. because now it's all about each individual's self-interest, each country's self-interest, and Europe does not feature in that. The Americans will use the Europeans for whatever they can, but they will not come to the aid of the Europeans, and that is simply because there is a fundamental difference between the current United States administration and much of the governments in the EU countries, as well as the government in the United Kingdom. You have diametrically opposed viewpoints. The government in the United States is, for want of a better word, a more right-leaning government. It is a government that is embracing policies of the past. It is a government that is embracing a more hardline stance and a more Christian valued stance. The governments in Europe, in a lot of the EU countries, with the exception of places like Slovakia and Hungary, when you look at Britain, when you look at Germany, these are countries that have gone, that are left-leaning governments, and they've embraced policies that have become really disastrous. But rather than walking back on some of those policies and finding a middle ground between the right and the left, you've got these governments that have come in and doubled down on those disastrous policies. And this is what you see playing out in Iran. The Americans are involved in Iran. The EU countries, together with Britain, refuse to get involved, not because they've suddenly grown a conscience, as I've said before. They are doing this because it's a tit-for-tat game. It's schoolgirl playground politics. You did this to me regarding Greenland. You do not want to help NATO. You are this and you are that. You've criticized us. You've said I am not a Churchill. So now I'm going to teach you a lesson. And this is what you see. While you see proxy wars fought against the Russians and the Chinese and fought against the Americans and the Europeans, you also see the Europeans fighting proxy wars, in a sense, against the Americans and vice versa. This is a split of Western ideology. And until one side does not capitulate, that means either the assassination of Donald Trump, where somebody comes in and the policies are a lot less antagonistic, or the impeachment of Donald Trump, or you wait out his 4-year term and a more left-leaning United States government comes in, you're not going to see that change. Or alternatively, like what you're seeing happening in Denmark, where Mette Frederiksen's government is now in a fight for its survival. And then you find more right-leaning governments coming in that will be allied to the thinking of the United States. Short of that, you're not going to find any consensus between these two. And in that vacuum, countries like Russia will thrive, because then you can afford to put one against the other. When you look at it, Keir Starmer had an option to pass this law a while back. Why is it that it's happening now? It's happening now because Donald Trump has lifted sanctions on Russian oil to stabilize the market. So by the Europeans, now look at this, right? The Europeans, the UK seizing these Russian oil tankers means they remove this oil from the oil supply. And what does that do? That helps push the oil supply, the oil price further upwards. That then increases the pain felt by the ordinary citizen. But again, they're doubling down, all the while knowing Zelensky and his friends are stealing the money that is being sent to Ukraine. All the while knowing that Zelensky doesn't care two hoots about his own people, let alone the people in Europe and the United Kingdom. Yet we still continue to do this. And our media and our intelligence services continue to perpetuate this myth that the Russians are out there. You know, everything that happens in the United Kingdom, if there's a storm, it's probably the Russians interfering with the weather. You know, yes, while the Russians do interfere with our relationships, we do the same with theirs. But at the end of the day, to make the Russians out to be this boogeyman, it is insane. You know, we could have sat down, included Russia when Putin wanted to join and become a part of NATO, when Putin wanted to join the Western world. That was our opportunity to have embraced. But we need to have this enemy, because that then keeps our governments afloat. that then justifies us having this threat hanging over our head to keep our population in control. And this is all it is. You cannot tell me that it is impossible that we could sit down and have decent relations with the Russians. I find that extremely difficult to believe. As long as we have these morons in government and in the intelligence services and in the police services that continue to perpetuate this myth, we will have nothing but discord. The world does not have to move in the direction it is moving in. It does not have to, because you can sit down. Yes, you will have rogue actors and you deal with them accordingly. But we also go out and actively turn other nations into rogue states because of our belligerent policies towards them. And while we highlight everything bad they do to us, we refuse to tell our people the bad things that we do to them. So, I always say, look at both sides of the story, because the truth, it lies somewhere in between. I fail to accept that we are this angel sitting on God's left shoulder, whilst the Russians are the devil sitting there waiting to consume us. I fail to accept that, because our past is not one that is so flowery and so full of happy days and singing kumbaya. So I think that when we are prepared to demonize other countries and talk about their duplicitous actions, I think we also need to do a lot of introspection, because a lot can be said about the way in which we handle our politics and our foreign policy. Now, yes, every country has strengths and weaknesses. Every country has strategic interests. And yes, you would want to put your strategic interests above others. But when you do it, in a manner in which you demonize and lie and vilify, I think that is wrong, because then you open a door to an unending conflict, and it just creates the instability. The world does not need to move in this direction, yet some of us try and force it down that path. Now, that article that I read was, John Healey talking about how they want to take on the Russians, was released on the 25th. You now find that some breaking news coming out that the sanctioned oil tanker enters UK waters a day after the government crackdown threat. That's covered by the BBC, so I'll put that article up here as well. An oil tanker sanctioned by the government has sailed through the English Channel, entering UK waters a day after a threat from ministers that such vessels can be boarded by UK armed forces. At one point, the Vayu 1, which has been sanctioned for carrying oil from Russia, was around 6 nautical miles off Dover, according to ship tracking data. It was tracked to this location on 26 March, the day after the government announced the UK forces had been given permission to board sanctioned ships transiting UK waters. When asked why it had not been stopped, the Ministry of Defence told BBC Verify an enforcement action is considered on a case-by-case basis. The Cameroon flag Vayu 1 began its journey from the Russian city of Murmansk on 10th March 2026, according to Marine Traffic. Data suggests it is carrying a full cargo. It first entered UK waters on 26 March at 12:39 GMT, and its presence was spotted by a user on X. Its final destination is not listed on the ship tracking website. The UK government added the Vayu 1 to its sanctions list in May 2025 due to suspected involvement in carrying Russian oil. The sanctions notice said the ship is involved in activity whose object or effect is to destabilize Ukraine or to obtain a benefit from or support the government of Russia. Namely, Vayu 1 is involved in carrying oil or oil products that originated in Russia from Russia to a third country. Now, you see, our reason for intercepting these ships, these tankers carrying Russian oil, is that it poses a threat to Ukraine. And why should that matter to us? I'll tell you why. We've invested a lot of time, money and effort and lives in this Ukraine debacle. And under Biden, it was all hunky-dory. Trump came in and upset the apple cart. He's effectively kicked out the Europeans and the UK from any form of negotiations. He knows he holds the trump card. Sorry for the pun. No, but he knows he holds that card, and he's dangling it over Zelensky's head, but as well as over the heads of the EU, NATO, as well as the UK. So what happens in this scenario? The Russians get control of the areas in Ukraine they want. The Americans and the Russians sit down and do business with that part of Ukraine, as well as between the two countries, Russia and the United States. And the EU, for all its efforts and endeavors, together with the UK, are now left on the sidelines carrying the can. How much of the money that they've invested into Ukraine will ever be paid back is probably going to amount to zero. And this is why the Europeans are pissed. But they also are to blame because they want to continue this war rather than look at some gain that they could benefit from this negotiated settlement. They want to see a capitulation of Russia. They want to see a balkanized Russia. And that is not going to happen. So because they're not prepared to yield from that stance, they're going to be left with nothing. The Americans and the Russians are going to reap the benefits out of this war in Ukraine. And that is why you find them behaving in this manner. They have now gone and been antagonistic towards the United States and Israel regarding the Hormuz Strait. And then again, that could backfire. Because tomorrow, if Donald Trump decides to walk away from Iran, he can call it a victory, walk away, and that's it, done. For optics, they'll do whatever in order to perpetuate it as a victory. However, the countries that are going to be hit the hardest are going to be Europe, because a lot of the products that they require and rely on come through the Strait of Hormuz from the Arabian Gulf. So again, they'll have to then negotiate with Iran in order to have these products reach Europe. And if the Americans are no longer involved in that war, then you find that the Iranians are going to employ mafia-like tactics and force the Europeans to pay taxes or a toll fee to have their tankers come through. So it's a win for Iran and it's a loss for the Europeans. Now they've lost in Ukraine and they'll be losing in the Straits of Hormuz. But again, nothing that these governments in Europe and the UK do ever makes sense. Because rather than sitting down and ironing out issues where you come out with at least half a loaf of bread, they prepared to come out with nothing just because they want to see an objective achieved. And that objective is not going to be achieved. That objective is not going to be achieved. They want Crimea back to Ukraine. They want total withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. No matter how hard you hit the Russians, blowing up their refineries and things, it's not going to change the matter on the battlefield. It's not. Every time the Ukrainians fire a drone or hit a target in Russia, the Western media, it's the next big thing. The Ukrainians are on the verge of taking over Moscow, Leningrad. That's the way they make it seem. You must be really desperate. You must really be desperate to look at something like that as a defining moment and a turn in the war where Ukraine then goes on to take back every bit of territory, including Crimea, but also then move within the Russian mainland. It just doesn't make sense. So this stopping of tankers and boarding Russian tankers is being antagonistic because the Americans have now desanctioned the Russian oil that was at sea. So we're going to keep a close eye on this and we'll keep you updated. But again, as I say, there are two separate issues here. The Ukraine war and the Iranian war. And they're both being fought by very similar players or the same players. And the reasons are more personal rather than anything else. And I fear that the Europeans and the UK are going to come out in a very bad way when these two wars end, because they're really going to be carrying the can for what is left behind, Because you must remember, any fallout from the Iran war adversely affects the Europeans. Any fallout from the Ukraine-Russia war directly affects the Europeans, because Ukraine and Russia are, for the large part, for a large mass of Russia is within Europe. So, Ukraine can't move to some other part of the world, and neither can Russia. The Americans are safe on their end of the world, and that is why it's going to hit home the hardest. Our leaders fail to recognize this, and rather, they always talk about peace, but their actions never signal peace. Talking about peace but arming an insurgency against the Russians does not, it doesn't speak of peace. So again, we're going to keep a close eye on this, and we'll monitor it and notify you accordingly. I want to thank you for spending time with us, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Please, you may not like everything I say, you may not agree with everything I say or anything that I say, but please like, share and subscribe, as it gets a dialogue going. And the more people that become aware of what is going on, and the more people that have opinions, the more vocal these opinions become. The more it then drags other people into conversations, and you then have a populace, one way or another, that becomes acutely aware of its surroundings and what is being perpetuated in the name of its people. So again, thank you for watching the video. Please remember to like, share and subscribe, as it helps us with the algorithm and it helps our channel to grow.